My name is Eya Hassan. I don't know that I really have an official position. I just usually I take care of communications. So I guess you could say I'm with PR. I usually do the translation of certain texts and publications before they're published, and also interviews and anything that involves external comms, I guess you could put it.
So yeah, I guess I'll start by asking, are imposing sanctions an important form of protest?
Yes, absolutely. So what people don't realize is that their wallet actually has a lot more power than they might think it does, in the sense that any self-respecting government is going to put the economy of their country first. And so by imposing sanctions, what we're doing is telling them that we disagree so strongly with their position that we're willing to affect their bottom line. And obviously, if they really want their country to flourish, they're going to have to make some kind of concessions, because if if enough people voice their disagreement with this kind of behavior, then I think that it's pretty safe to say that maybe they might want to reconsider, just in order to avoid the sanctions. And they can take different forms, of course. For example, what we're seeing with Russia right now, where their soccer team has been banned from participating in FIFA. And in the States, they've stopped selling Russian-made vodka, for example. These are just a couple of things that, a couple of different kind of sanctions that we can impose on these countries or on these governments, in order to let them know in a non-violent way that we disagree with their position or their actions, whichever the case may be.
What are other forms of protests that directly impact governments, and maybe not citizens, if that's possible, because I know there's kind of the issue with sanctions also negatively affecting Russians and Russians abroad, and I guess otherwhere where sanctions are opposed.
Right. So if we're looking at the big picture, there are really three types of actions that we can take. Other than the sanctions, there's also boycotting and divestment. So those two, they kind of fit in the same sense that, again, it's directed at the government. It's not meant to hurt the population. It's not meant to affect people who, may or may not agree with what the government is doing. And the whole point of boycotting, again, is just to say, if we're taking away this type of revenue from the government, they have less tax revenue, they have less revenue in general, especially if they profit from, let's say, if we're talking about what we're doing with the BDS movement for Israel, is we're just not buying from illegally occupied territories. And so in that sense, if we're removing that power from the illegal settlements, when the government realizes that they're not profitable, that they're actually costing them money, in the sense that there are no jobs to find there, or they can't really claim any kind of revenue from that area because of everything that's happening, they may take a step back. And that's really the idea behind the BDS movement, is show them that we care about what they're doing. Maybe not in a positive way. We're noticing what they're doing, and we don't agree with the way that they're treating the natives, the native population to that land. And we don't like that they're being so flippant about it. They're, taking a lot of liberties that they should not be taking. And we're letting them know by hitting where it hurts.
Thank you so much. And do you find it frustrating that, I do acknowledge that the situation in Ukraine, it does have such, the threat of a nuclear war, essentially. But do you think it is frustrating and hypocritical of the Canadian government to apply sanctions to Russia so easily, when there are some politicians that will call the BDS movement anti-Semitic and more?
Absolutely. So there are many reasons for that. You mentioned also that actually it's a very interesting point that they consider the BDS movement to be anti-Semitic, whereas the BDS movement doesn't target specifically Jewish people. It doesn't, target anybody based on their ethnicity or their religious background. It's really just a movement to let the government of Israel know that we don't agree with their actions. And it absolutely is hypocritical because, literally overnight, we're seeing all kinds of sanctions being put on Russia. But none of those sanctions are being put on Israel, and Russia has only just begun, and they haven't done nearly as much damage as in Ukraine as Israel has done in occupied Palestinian territories. Not to mention that Israel has been doing this for since the 40s, so that's quite a while to get away with all the what have they done? They've evicted families from their homes. They've bulldozed said homes once they were cleared out so they could make space for more settlers. They've been abusing Palestinians. They've been violating airspace in surrounding areas, including Lebanon. They're not behaving in a way that can be considered ethical, and they've been accused of war crimes, are currently being investigated for them. They're also, again, they're getting away with everything, even though they're clearly an apartheid regime, which, was officially declared by Amnesty recently. And so to see all of this happen and not see any kind of sanctions being imposed on them, they're not seeing any kind of consequences to their actions, even though their, kill rate is insanely high. We've got literal proof, video evidence, documented evidence of them committing all these crimes, killing children, and again, invading territories that don't belong to them, where they have no right to be, and yet nothing is happening to them because, I guess for whatever reason, either the West needs a foothold in the Middle East and they consider that Israel is a good ally for that, or sometimes it's for religious reasons. A lot of people who support Israel are actually not Jewish; they're actually just Christians, and that fits into their vision. So they support the Holy Land because they think it's their promised land and they think it's related to their salvation. But when it comes to Russia, because they have no political or religious ties to that land, they have no problem imposing sanctions, in as a response to the beginning of their military assault. It hasn't started yet, and they're already being sanctioned, whereas Israel has been doing this for over 7 years, and have yet to see any kind of sanction or consequence to their actions.
Okay, I just have one last question, and thank you so much for your answer. Do you think that the sanctions imposed upon the Ukraine by Canada, do you think that this could be maybe a starting point for activists to push for sanctions on all economies that are responsible for apartheid, even, removing Canada's military exports to not only Israel, but Saudi Arabia as well?
Yeah, and I mean, we saw that also in South Africa in the 80s, where the very same concept, the same BDS movement actually led to the abolition of their apartheid movement. So it's obviously not the only solution. It's not the be all end all. It's definitely not going to solve everything, but it's part of it. And so if we start looking at sanctions being imposed, and we get enough people involved where, they care enough about a country that isn't, mostly white or Christian, we might be able to see something, concrete really happen. But again, for many, many reasons, economical, political, it looks like we're having a little trouble getting sanctions imposed on the countries that we want to see sanctioned, including, Saudi Arabia and Israel. And It might be a step, but I don't know how far it's going to go, or I don't know how far this is going to carry on or over into other positions. Because if we were to oppose, you know, if we're to play the devil's advocate here, if we were to impose the same kind of sanctions on every country that we know that has committed war crimes, that has been unethical, or that has abused its own population or neighboring populations, we'd be cutting a lot of ties. And I don't know if people are ready for that. So again, it's a baby step, and it's up to the people, you know, to make their decisions and decide how far they're willing to go in that movement. But I think that, you know, if anything, if the sanctions on Russia end up, you know, working to a certain extent, that we might see a renewed sense of hope in the face of the Palestine-Israel conflict.